The chamber of the Galactic Council had never known silence, not in 10,000 recorded assemblies, not during declarations of extermination, not even when stars were sentenced to collapse under sanctioned bombardment. The chamber was built for sound, its vaulted crystalline dome designed to refract the voices of 1,000 species into something harmonious, something civilized. But on that day, silence fell like gravity. I felt it in the pressure chambers beneath my exoskeleton, a tightening of atmosphere as if the station itself feared what was unfolding. The luminous rings above us dimmed, reacting to lowered vocal frequencies across the amphitheater. Even the translation lattice hovering in the center, an ever-shifting web of light converting languages into shared comprehension, flickered uncertainly. Humanity stood alone at the center dais. No escort frigates shimmered in orbit beyond the viewport. No honor guard flanked their representative. No visible augmentations, no ceremonial armor, no adaptive shielding humming beneath fabric. Only one human. Small by our standards, soft-skinned, wrapped in simple diplomatic attire of dark blue and silver thread. Their hands rested loosely behind their back as though they were observing a cultural exhibit rather than standing trial before the most powerful political entity in the known galaxy. I remember thinking how fragile they looked. I remember thinking how easily we could erase them. The charges were projected above them in radiant glyphs. Unauthorized entry into a sovereign war zone, interference in an active border conflict, extraction of civilian populations without council mandate, violation of non-intervention doctrine. Murmurs rippled through the assembly tiers, Virelian tendrils coiling in agitation, Korth-armored limbs striking the floor in restrained fury, elder delegates whispering through harmonic frequencies too low for most species to detect. Humanity had embarrassed them. For 73 cycles, the border war between the Virelian hegemony and the Korth ascendancy had remained contained, profitable, predictable. Civilian casualties, unfortunate but statistically tolerable. Then human relief ships arrived. They had crossed battle lines without weapons powered, projected humanitarian transponder codes, deployed evacuation corridors in the midst of active bombardment. And when fired upon, they had not fired back. They had raised shields and continued loading children. The audacity of it. The presiding speaker's voice echoed through the chamber, layered and resonant. Humanity is called to answer for destabilizing a sanctioned equilibrium. Sanctioned equilibrium, a refined phrase for tolerated suffering. The human ambassador inclined their head slightly. No tremor, no visible spike in stress pheromones. Their species biology fascinated our analysts, heart rates accelerating under threat, cortisol levels surging, yet this one stood in eerie stillness. "We acknowledge entering the conflict zone," the human said. Their voice was unamplified, yet it carried. The acoustic architecture of the chamber favored confidence. "We acknowledge evacuating civilians." A pause. "We do not acknowledge wrongdoing." The chamber reacted as if struck. Several delegates rose simultaneously, bioluminescent crests flaring. The Korth representative's armored carapace emitted a grinding resonance, a sound associated with pre-assault posture. I felt my secondary hearts accelerate. The human continued. When children are dying in crossfire, procedure becomes secondary. The translation lattice shimmered, ensuring no nuance was lost. When medical ships are denied entry because the paperwork is incomplete, conscience must override protocol. Whispers intensified. "You claim neutrality," the human said, turning slowly to face the semicircle of elder species. "But neutrality that permits suffering is not balance, it is avoidance." I saw the Virelian delegate recoil as though physically struck. This was not how lesser species spoke before the council. They pleaded, they negotiated, they cited economic dependencies and trade concessions. They did not accuse us. The presiding speaker's tone cooled. "You presume moral authority over civilizations older than your star's industrial era." The human did something unexpected. They smiled, not mockingly, not triumphantly, but with something that resembled sadness. "No," they replied softly. "We presume responsibility." The chamber's temperature regulation dropped 2 degrees, a subconscious response triggered by collective agitation. Holographic displays ignited around the dais. Footage from the war zone. Human ships drifting through debris fields, holes scarred from glancing strikes. Medics carrying Virelian hatchlings alongside Korth juveniles. Human volunteers forming living barriers as bombardments lit the void behind them. Casualty graphs overlaid the images. Civilian deaths plummeting the moment humans arrived. War support metrics among both populations declining sharply. Recruitment numbers falling. The war had not ended yet, but it was weakening, and everyone in that chamber understood the implication. The human ambassador deactivated the projections. We did not fire a single offensive shot. We did not seize territory. We did not demand tribute. A measured breath. We simply refused to let children die because it was politically convenient. Silence expanded outward like a shockwave. Sanction proposals flickered into existence along the chamber's edge. Trade embargo, fleet restriction, suspension of voting rights, forced oversight. We had the power to isolate their species. We had the power to cripple their economy. We had the power to remind them of their place. The presiding speaker initiated preliminary vote sequencing. And that was when I noticed something I had never witnessed in my centuries of service. Hesitation. Minor species delegates, those who rarely influenced outcomes, were not signaling automatic compliance. Their bioluminescent indicators remained dim, their neural bands quiet. They were watching the human. The human, meanwhile, had finished speaking. No final appeal, no strategic bargaining. They simply stood there.
Waiting. Not with defiance, not with fear, but with certainty. As if the outcome mattered less than the action already taken. The chamber's luminous dome dimmed further, responding to the drop in collective sound. Even the ever-present hum of life support systems seemed muted. For the first time in council history, the debate was not erupting into layered argumentation. No one was speaking, because the question had shifted. It was no longer whether humanity had broken our laws. It was whether our laws deserved to remain unchallenged. I felt something unfamiliar stir within my cognitive core. Doubt. Around the chamber, ancient empires, species that had survived supernovas and purges and civilizational collapses, remained silent before a single, unarmored human. The vote countdown began to illuminate above the dais, and still no one moved. We should have known long before they ever stood in our chamber, long before the silence, long before the vote that never happened, because by every metric we possessed, humanity should not exist. When their electromagnetic leakage first reached our deep-range observatories, we cataloged them as we do all emerging civilizations, coldly, clinically, without expectation. Their homeworld rotated around an unremarkable yellow star on the fringe of a minor spiral arm. Atmospheric composition, volatile but breathable. Tectonic activity, extreme. Climatic variance, catastrophic. Biosphere, violently competitive. Classification was immediate. Death world. I remember the xenobiology briefings, vast oceans capable of generating planetary storms visible from orbit, continental plates grinding against each other, reshaping land masses within evolutionary timescales, predatory megafauna with bone-crushing jaws, microorganisms capable of extinguishing entire populations, no stabilizing planetary ring systems, no engineered climate regulators left behind by precursor species, no sign of external intervention. Evolution on such a world typically favors armor, venom, hive cognition, rapid reproduction, not humans. When we first analyzed their physiology, the chamber laughed. Soft epidermal layers, internal skeletal structure, inefficient and vulnerable, limited sensory spectrum, no natural plasma discharge, no psionic field generation, no biological weaponry beyond blunt force and tool use. They were exposed. And yet, they dominated their planet, not through superior biology, through adaptation, through cooperation, through something our analysts initially misclassified as irrational optimism. We watched their history in accelerated simulations, their early tribes competing over resources in brutal, localized conflicts, then expanding, organizing, warring on scales that scarred continents. They invented weapons capable of vaporizing cities before they achieved stable planetary governance. Several elder species recommended pre-contact quarantine. A species that volatile, on a world that hostile, should logically self-extinguish. But they did not. Pandemics swept their continents. They created vaccines. Global wars engulfed their nations. They built alliances. Economic collapses fractured their societies. They restructured systems and tried again. Each time they approached extinction, they did something statistically improbable. They learned. Not perfectly, not peacefully, but persistently. Our long-term projections began to falter. By the time they achieved faster-than-light capability, primitive, unstable, barely efficient, we had already revised their extinction probability downward 7 times. Still, we were not impressed. When first contact protocols were initiated, the prevailing expectation among the Council was simple. Humanity would become a peripheral species, traders of raw materials, perhaps skilled engineers, possibly mercenaries. Deathworlders often adapt well to military contracts. They arrived at the diplomatic rendezvous with visible excitement. No cloaked armadas, no hidden war fleets lurking beyond the star's gravity well. Their vessels were functional, inelegant, bearing the aesthetic marks of rapid industrial iteration. They brought gifts, cultural archives, art, music encoded in harmonic sequences, mathematical proofs offered as tokens of peaceful intent. It was disarming. We granted them provisional council observer status, assuming their influence would remain minimal. We were wrong. Within 2 decades, human trade vessels began appearing in regions long ignored by major powers, systems suffering famine due to disrupted hyperlane access, colonies abandoned after resource depletion, minor species trapped in debt spirals engineered by corporate blocs. Humans transported food at a loss. Our economic models flagged the behavior as unsustainable, yet the trade routes they established stabilized peripheral markets, which in turn increased long-term profitability. They mediated disputes between species who refused dialogue for centuries. Their diplomats lacked the layered etiquette of elder civilizations, yet they possessed something unexpectedly effective: empathy, unfiltered by superiority. They listened, and then they proposed compromises so obvious we were embarrassed not to have considered them. I recall a territorial conflict between 2 aquatic species over orbital mining rights. Negotiations had stalled for 90 cycles. Humans proposed a rotational extraction schedule, paired with shared environmental restoration funding. The agreement was signed within a week. We began using a new term in our internal briefings: human unpredictability. They did not follow established power gradients. They did not exploit weakness in the conventional sense. They sought mutual gain where we anticipated dominance hierarchies. This made them difficult to model, and in galactic politics, what cannot be modeled cannot be controlled. Some elder delegates dismissed their actions as youthful idealism. They will mature, one Virillian strategist stated. Compassion erodes under realpolitik. But compassion did not erode. It scaled. When famine struck the outer Rithari systems, human cargo fleets arrived before Council aid committees finalized feasibility studies. When a mining disaster trapped a Korth labor contingent beneath a collapsed asteroid crust, it was human engineers who volunteered for rescue operations in unstable gravitational fields. They absorbed losses, financial, material, biological, and they kept going. Their military capacity remained moderate, respectable but not dominant. Their fleets were efficient but not overwhelming. Their technology innovative but not revolutionary. Yet influence metrics told a different story. Trust indices among minor species began trending towards human systems. Diplomatic dependency graphs shifted subtly, not dramatically enough to alarm the Council, but enough to change the equation. They were not becoming the strongest species within our alliance. They were becoming the connective tissue, and connective tissue once severed can cripple a body. We should have known long before they ever stood in our chamber, long before the silence, long before the vote that never happened. Because by every metric we possessed, humanity should not exist. When their electromagnetic leakage first reached our deep-range observatories, we cataloged them as we do all emerging civilizations, coldly, clinically, without expectation. Their homeworld rotated around an unremarkable yellow star on the fringe of a minor spiral arm. Atmospheric composition, volatile but breathable. Tectonic activity, extreme. Climatic variance, catastrophic. Biosphere, violently competitive.
There are wars that reshape galaxies, and there are wars we allow to continue. The border conflict between the Virelian hegemony and the Korth ascendancy belonged to the second category. 73 cycles of calculated attrition, skirmishes along disputed hyperlane corridors, orbital strikes carefully limited to military infrastructure, officially. Civilian losses categorized as collateral variables. Trade routes rerouted just enough to maintain pressure, never enough to provoke collapse. It was, by Council definition, stable. We monitored fleet movements through long-range arrays. We tracked casualty projections. We hosted periodic negotiations designed less to end the conflict than to regulate its temperature. Controlled violence preserves balance. That was the doctrine. The contested system itself was strategically unremarkable. 2 mineral-rich planets, 1 habitable moon, and a cluster of asteroid refineries. But pride magnified its importance. Historical grievances stretched back centuries. Neither side could withdraw without appearing diminished. So the war endured. Profitable for weapons manufacturers, convenient for political hardliners, predictable. Until humanity interfered. The first human vessels entered the system under civilian transponder codes. Hospital ships, cargo carriers retrofitted for mass evacuation, escort craft lightly armed, defensive configurations only. We assumed it was a miscalculation, a naive attempt to negotiate access. Then they broadcast their intention on an open channel. We are establishing humanitarian corridors. Civilian evacuation will commence immediately. The message was transmitted simultaneously to both the Virelian and Korth command structures. The response was immediate outrage. The Virelian hegemony declared the action a violation of sovereign territory. The Korth ascendancy threatened to treat unauthorized ships as hostile assets. Humanity's reply contained a single line: "Children are not combatants." When the transcript reached the Council archives, several delegates emitted audible amusement. Idealism again. The first evacuation convoy should have failed. Korth artillery platforms recalibrated targeting arrays as human transports entered contested orbit. Virelian interceptor squadrons locked missile solutions. Crossfire illuminated the void in pulses of violent light. Human ships raised shields. They did not return fire. They positioned themselves between bombardment vectors and civilian population centers. Our analysts predicted catastrophic losses. Instead, something unexpected occurred. Korth targeting algorithms flagged the human vessels as civilian class under interstellar conventions. To fire directly would constitute a war crime by Council standards. The Virelian command hesitated for similar reasons. Humanity exploited the hesitation. Evacuation shuttles descended through debris-laden skies. Human medics established triage zones in underground shelters. Refugee transports began departing in steady streams, first dozens, then hundreds. Both sides issued formal protests to the Council. We acknowledged receipt and did nothing, because officially humanity was not deploying offensive force. They were merely present. Within 2 cycles, civilian casualty reports shifted. Projected deaths plummeted. War planners on both sides recalculated attrition models and found them disrupted. Civilian suffering had been a silent pressure mechanism, a factor that hardened public resolve against the enemy. Now evacuation footage circulated across planetary networks. Images of human medics carrying Virelian hatchlings, while Korth soldiers provided covering fire against stray bombardment. Footage of human engineers repairing water purification systems in cities claimed by opposing factions only hours apart. The narrative destabilized.
Propaganda became harder to sustain when the supposed enemy's children were shown boarding the same relief ship. War support metrics began to fall. At first, only marginally, then sharply. Korth infantry units reported increased instances of hesitation during urban offensives. Virelian pilots aborted strike runs when human hospital markers appeared in targeting overlays. We observed the data with growing discomfort. Humanity had introduced a variable we had not accounted for: visibility. By placing themselves physically between combatants and civilians, they forced each side to confront the human cost of their actions in real time. And because they refused to retaliate, escalation became politically untenable. When a Korth cruiser accidentally clipped a human transport with a glancing plasma discharge, killing 17 volunteers, humanity did not mobilize its fleet. They broadcast the names of the deceased and continued evacuations. That act resonated more powerfully than any retaliatory strike. Within 10 cycles, the war's momentum faltered. Recruitment numbers declined across both powers. Economic backers began questioning long-term sustainability. Border commanders requested strategic reassessment. The conflict did not end in a decisive battle. It unraveled. Not because humanity overpowered either side, but because they made the continuation of war morally indefensible. That terrified the elder species. If a mid-tier death-world civilization could destabilize a 73-cycle conflict without firing offensive shot, what else could they destabilize? What of trade monopolies built on exploitative contracts? What of resource extraction zones maintained through quiet coercion? What of our own carefully balanced indifferences? The Virelian hegemony and the Korth ascendancy did something unprecedented. They filed a joint complaint. Former enemies unified in grievance against humanity. The accusation? Unauthorized intervention leading to political destabilization and economic loss. Privately, their delegates expressed a different concern. Humanity had humiliated them by implying that mercy was strength. The council convened in emergency session. I reviewed the preliminary sanctions proposals myself. Fleet restrictions, fines, mandatory compliance oversight in future conflicts. We framed it as a matter of procedural integrity. No species, regardless of intent, could unilaterally redefine interstellar norms. But beneath the formal language lay something far less comfortable: fear. Because if morality could unravel a profitable war, then the entire architecture of controlled violence upon which our stability rested was vulnerable. When the emergency summons was transmitted to humanity, they responded without delay. Their ambassador accepted attendance before the council. No defensive fleet mobilized, no diplomatic leverage threatened. They arrived alone. And as I took my position within the chamber that day, reviewing the complaint scrolls of 2 ancient powers, I believed we were preparing to discipline an impulsive young species. I believed we would reassert precedent, restore order, remind humanity of its place within the hierarchy of civilizations. I did not yet understand that the hierarchy itself had already shifted, because somewhere between the first evacuation shuttle and the final ceasefire communique, something irreversible had occurred. The galaxy had seen another way to wage influence, and it was not built on fear. As the council's luminous dome brightened for emergency assembly, I glanced at the human representatives standing at the central dais. Unarmed, unapologetic, calm. We thought we were summoning them to answer for destabilizing a war. We did not realize we were about to answer for tolerating one. Judgment in the Galactic Council is rarely dramatic. It is procedural, layered in precedent, buffered by committees and subcommittees until outrage cools into paperwork. But that day, judgment burned bright. The chamber shimmered with holographic projections, fleet trajectories traced in crimson arcs, communication intercepts suspended like frozen lightning, economic graphs cascading downward in sharp angular declines. Every unauthorized jump made by human relief ships was displayed. Every transmission that bypassed council clearance codes replayed in perfect clarity. The charges were irrefutable. violation of sovereign territory, interference in an active military engagement, destabilization of recognized territorial equilibrium, and economic disruption across 3 sectors. The presiding speaker's voice resonated through the crystalline dome. Humanity acted without mandate, without authorization, without regard for established doctrine. Around the amphitheater, elder delegates signaled agreement. Virelian tendrils glowed with controlled indignation. Korth armor plates emitted low-frequency vibrations, barely restrained hostility. Sanction proposals rotated above the central dais. Trade embargo, suspension of council voting privileges, mandatory fleet inspections, forced demilitarization of humanitarian vessels operating in contested space. Measured punishments, calculated, severe enough to deter repetition, restrained enough to avoid escalation. I studied the human ambassador as the evidence scrolled around them. They did not attempt to interrupt. They did not challenge the data.
When the speaker concluded, the chamber lights focused inward. Humanity may present its defense. A pause stretched across the void between stars. The human stepped forward. "We do not dispute the facts," they began. A ripple of confusion moved through the chamber. Most species confronted with such charges began with technicalities, jurisdictional ambiguities, translation discrepancies, historical precedents. The human offered none. "We entered sovereign space. We evacuated civilians. We disrupted supply chains tied to the conflict." Their gaze swept across the semicircle of towering forms and armored silhouettes. "We did so intentionally." Outrage flared. The Korth representative struck the floor with a reinforced limb, sending a resonant shockwave through the platform. "You admit willful violation of interstellar law?" "Yes," the human replied evenly. "We admit willful prevention of civilian death." The translation lattice shimmered, ensuring the words carried unaltered. Without further preamble, the human activated their own projection field. The chamber dimmed. Images replaced graphs. A Virelian hatchling clinging to a human medic's suit as bombardment thundered in the distance. A Korth adolescent, armor cracked and leaking atmosphere, being stabilized by human field surgeons, while Virelian civilians waited nearby for treatment. Human volunteers forming a corridor through falling debris, guiding civilians toward shuttle ramps as explosions bloomed overhead. There were no triumphant soundtracks, no dramatic overlays, only recorded reality. "You fear destabilization," the human said quietly. The images shifted, civilian casualty curves plunging downward after humanitarian corridors were established, economic models stabilizing weeks after ceasefire negotiations resumed. But what you call balance was simply prolonged suffering. A wave of bioluminescent agitation rippled outward. Several elder delegates rose to full height, an unmistakable signal of offense. The Virelian envoy's voice cut sharply through the chamber. "You presume to redefine stability?" "We observed its consequences," the human answered. The speaker intervened. "Stability preserves galactic cohesion." "At what cost?" the human asked. No one responded immediately. The images shifted again. Reconstruction footage, formerly contested mining platforms operating under joint oversight, trade vessels, Virelian and Korth, docking at shared orbital hubs, agricultural shipments moving through corridors once saturated with weapons fire. Trade volume data overlaid the images, already surpassing pre-war projections. The war was over, not because either side achieved decisive victory, but because the political will to continue had eroded, and that erosion began the moment human ships placed themselves between artillery and children. A Korth strategist attempted rebuttal. "Economic growth does not justify unauthorized interference." Agreed. Economic growth does not justify anything. A subtle emphasis. We did not act for profit. The chamber quieted fractionally. We acted because no one else would. That accusation hung heavier than any sanction. I felt it settle into the recesses of my cognition.
No one else would. For 73 cycles, we had monitored the war, adjusted trade algorithms, hosted negotiations designed to manage escalation rather than end it. We had called it prudence. They called it indifference. The speaker initiated final deliberation protocols. Delegate sigils ignited around the amphitheater, each delegate's authority represented by a luminous glyph awaiting activation. Sanctions required majority consensus. The outcome, by all predictive models, should have been decisive. I prepared to cast my vote in accordance with established doctrine. Then something unprecedented occurred. A minor species delegate, representative of a minor agricultural consortium rarely involved in major decisions, dimmed their voting glyph. Abstention. Murmurs spread. Another followed, then another. Small powers, economically modest, politically quiet. Public abstentions, not secret dissent, visible refusal to endorse punishment. The speaker's harmonic frequencies shifted, betraying rare uncertainty. Delegates are reminded that abstention constitutes non-support of procedural enforcement. The agricultural delegate responded, voice trembling yet resolute. We benefited from humanitarian relief during the Rethary famine. We will not sanction them for offering the same elsewhere. Silence deepened. A trade coalition from the outer rim dimmed its glyph, then a mining consortium. The abstentions did not form a majority, but they fractured unanimity, and unanimity was the Council's greatest weapon. The Virelian envoy hissed, "You would undermine interstellar law for sentiment?" The agricultural delegate answered, "For consistency." The word struck like a gravitational anomaly. Consistency. If humanitarian action was punishable in one system, what message did that send to every minor world reliant on the Council's protection? The human ambassador stood motionless amidst the unfolding disruption. They did not exploit it. They did not speak again. They simply watched. The final vote sequence recalculated probabilities in real time. What was once near certain sanction now balanced precariously between enforcement and fracture. I hovered my appendage over my activation sigil. For centuries, I had believed stability required controlled violence, managed suffering, strategic indifference. But as I observed the abstention glyphs glowing softly across the chamber, I felt the architecture of that belief strain. Humanity had not weakened the galaxy. The data proved the opposite. They had strengthened it, not through dominance, through defiance of apathy. The speaker called for final confirmation. "Delegates, cast your votes." The luminous dome dimmed to near darkness, awaiting the surge of collective decision. Across the amphitheater, elder powers hesitated, because to sanction humanity would reaffirm doctrine, but to proceed in the face of visible abstention would expose division. The silence that followed was heavier than any verdict, and for the first time in Council history, the greatest threat to galactic order was not rebellion. It was conscience. Power, as we had always defined it, was measurable. Fleet tonnage, orbital cannons, energy reserves capable of sterilizing continents. We quantified strength in destructive yield and territorial control. We graphed influence through economic leverage and military reach. Humanity possessed none of these in overwhelming abundance, and yet, in the cycles leading to the vote, our projections began to fracture. It started quietly. Peripheral systems, minor trade hubs, and agricultural worlds began transmitting formal communications to the Council. At first, we categorized them as routine diplomatic traffic. They were not. They were declarations, not of alliance, not of rebellion, of gratitude.
The first came from a drought-stricken colony in the Outer Rim. Their message was simple. Human cargo fleets had delivered atmospheric processors during a climate collapse. Without them, population loss would have exceeded 60%. The second originated from a mining consortium once trapped in debt restructuring for decades. Human mediators had renegotiated exploitative contracts in exchange for long-term cooperative trade. The third was from a species I had nearly forgotten, a minor amphibious civilization displaced by orbital instability. Human engineers had helped relocate their floating habitats without demanding territorial concessions. The messages multiplied. Each one formally stated a position. Sanctioning humanity would be viewed as punitive action against humanitarian conduct. At first, elder delegates dismissed the transmissions as emotional noise. Then the analysts compiled the numbers. I remember the moment the projection appeared in the Council's private strategic overlay. If sanctions were enacted, 32 peripheral systems were statistically likely to withdraw economic cooperation in protest. Not militarily, economically. Trade routes would shift toward human-aligned corridors. Supply chains feeding core manufacturing sectors would experience measurable disruption. Resource flow through 3 hyperlane junctions would decline by 17% within a single cycle. 17%. To an untrained observer, negligible. To a system built on precise equilibrium, catastrophic. Humanity had no massive armada poised at our borders, no hidden superweapon, but they had cultivated something we had neglected for millennia: trust. And trust, once activated collectively, behaves like gravity. It bends trajectories. Elder species began recalculating risk assessments in urgent subchannels. I monitored private exchanges between Varelian strategists and Korth economic planners, former enemies now united in shared concern. "This is unsustainable," one Varelian envoy transmitted. "If peripheral systems realign, core authority erodes." The Korth response was immediate. Sanctioning them may accelerate that erosion. We had intended to discipline a mid-tier civilization for procedural violation. Instead, we faced the possibility of cascading fragmentation. I studied humanity's fleet registry during those cycles. Modest expansion, defensive configurations, continued investment in relief infrastructure rather than warship escalation. No sign of coercive mobilization. They were not threatening us. They did not need to. Because loyalty born of fear dissolves the moment fear weakens. Loyalty born of compassion persists. And that was the variable we had failed to model. Across the networked systems of the galaxy, citizens who had never met a council delegate had encountered humans during their worst moments: famine, disaster, war. To them, humanity was not a political abstraction. It was the species that showed up. When analysts simulated enforcement scenarios, the results were sobering. Sanctions would signal to peripheral worlds that humanitarian intervention was punishable. Confidence in council neutrality would decline. Smaller species would seek alternative power centers, voluntarily gravitating toward human trade networks. Not because humanity demanded it, but because they felt safer there. The elder species began to understand the paradox. We possessed dreadnoughts capable of obliterating planetary defenses. Humanity possessed cargo ships capable of rebuilding them. Which inspired deeper allegiance? For the first time in centuries of service, power metrics felt incomplete. I observed the human ambassador in the chamber during recess intervals. They conversed quietly with minor delegates. No grand speeches, no strategic maneuvering, just dialogue. It was infuriatingly effective. They had not engineered the support through manipulation. They had earned it through action. The council reconvened for final deliberation. The chamber was quieter than before, not with uncertainty, but with comprehension. Sanctioning humanity would preserve doctrine, but it would expose our priorities. Punishing a species for preventing civilian deaths would send a message far beyond the Varelian Korth border. It would confirm what many peripheral systems already suspected, that the Council valued order over lives. I felt the weight of centuries pressing upon my cognition. We had cultivated fear. We had cultivated deterrence. We had cultivated compliance. We had not cultivated trust. And trust, once concentrated in another species, shifts the center of gravity. The presiding speaker requested final economic projections. They flickered above us. Trade disruption models, alliance probability trees, confidence indices trending downward in sanction scenarios. The numbers were undeniable. Humanity's power was not explosive, it was connective. Remove them and fractures spread. Allow them autonomy and the network stabilized. The realizations settled across the chamber like cosmic dust. Power was no longer measured solely in dreadnought tonnage or orbital cannons. It was measured in who answered distress calls. It was measured in who rebuilt shattered cities. It was measured in whether minor species believed the galaxy cared if they survived.
The council remained silent, not because we lacked arguments, not because outrage had faded, but because we understood the implications. To sanction humanity would be to declare that compassion was subordinate to convenience, and if we made that declaration publicly, we would lose more than trade routes. We would lose legitimacy. Across the amphitheater, elder delegates dimmed their private channels. No one wished to be the first to acknowledge it openly, but we all saw it. Humanity had altered the calculus of power without firing a shot. They had accumulated allies without signing formal pacts. They had shifted economic gravity without issuing threats. We had miscalculated them as naive. We had mistaken restraint for weakness. Now we faced a truth more destabilizing than any border war. If trust became the dominant currency of galactic influence, then the species best at earning it would shape the future. And for the first time since their arrival on the interstellar stage, I understood why the chamber had fallen silent, because the balance of power had already changed, and none of us knew how to control it. The countdown lights above the central dais began their descent. 10 luminous sigils, each representing procedural finality, ignited one by one along the inner ring of the chamber dome. When the last light faded, the vote would lock, sanctions would be enacted, precedent would be preserved. It should have been simple. Sanctioning humanity would reaffirm doctrine. Unauthorized intervention could not be tolerated regardless of outcome. But the projections hovering before us refused simplicity. 2 models rotated in silent opposition. Sanction scenario, short-term procedural stability, long-term economic fragmentation, peripheral descent probability increasing exponentially. Non-sanction scenario, doctrinal ambiguity, expanded humanitarian exceptions, gradual shift in power perception toward moral authority. Preserve precedent or preserve unity. The speaker's voice resonated, steady but strained. Delegates will now confirm final positions. Before any sigil activated, a request signal pulsed from the Varelian delegation. A procedural delay. The chamber murmured, an unusual sound at this stage of judgment. Delays during final countdown were rare, nearly taboo. State your clarification, the speaker commanded. The Varelian representative rose to full height, bioluminescent crests subdued rather than flaring. The once indignant accuser now appeared restrained. Our civilian networks, the Varelian representative began, have conducted independent sentiment analysis. A ripple of discomfort spread across the amphitheater. 82% of our population credits human intervention with the preservation of familial units within the contested system. The translation lattice shimmered. In simpler terms, the Varelian delegate continued, voice tightening, our people view humans as protectors. The word echoed uncomfortably against the crystalline walls. To sanction them, the delegate concluded, would be perceived domestically as punishment for mercy. Silence deepened. A second request signal flared this time from the Korth Ascendancy. Their armored representative rose with mechanical precision. Our internal projections mirror the Varelian assessment. Civilian sectors across our territory display unprecedented approval metrics toward humanity. A pause. If sanctions proceed, civil unrest probability increases beyond acceptable thresholds. It was unprecedented. 2 elder powers, fresh from decades of mutual hostility, now aligned in caution, not out of affection for humanity, but out of political reality.
The speaker's harmonic frequencies shifted, betraying tension. The council does not legislate based on populist fluctuation. No, the Korth replied, but we must govern within it. The countdown lights paused at 4. Procedural interruption. Another signal pulsed, from a trade consortium representing 12 minor systems. We request ethical review expansion, their delegate stated, specifically regarding civilian protection mandates during contained conflicts. Ethical review expansion. The phrase was bureaucratic. Its implication was revolutionary. One by one, elder delegates began requesting clarifications, not outright opposition, not endorsement, delay, study, reassessment. The chamber transformed from execution platform into philosophical battleground.
I felt the ground shift beneath centuries of certainty. Sanctioning humanity would be legally sound, but politically destabilizing. Supporting them openly would validate their actions and implicitly condemn our prior inaction. The human ambassador remained motionless at the center. No triumphant expression, no visible anticipation, just patience, as though they had already accepted whatever outcome emerged. The speaker attempted to regain procedural momentum. Deliberation time has elapsed. The vote must proceed. But the Virillian delegate spoke again, this time not as accuser, but as reluctant witness. Our war ended, they said quietly. Reconstruction has surpassed projected recovery curves. Joint resource agreements have stabilized previously volatile sectors. Their luminescent crests dimmed further. We cannot deny these outcomes. The Korth representative added, nor can we deny that these outcomes began when humans intervened. A tremor of realization moved through the chamber. For 73 cycles, we had justified non-intervention in the name of balance. Yet balance had not produced peace. Human interference had. The speaker's final attempt to initiate the vote faltered as another abstention signal flickered preemptively across the amphitheater. Then another. Not votes against sanction, refusals to participate in punishment. The architecture of unanimity cracked visibly. And in that fracture, something irreversible occurred. The speaker lowered their tonal register, a sign of concession rarely displayed in open session. In light of emerging ethical considerations, they declared, the matter of sanctions against humanity is hereby placed under continued evaluation. A procedural phrase, sanitized, bloodless, but everyone present understood its meaning. The vote was dissolved. No sanctions enacted, no precedent reinforced. Officially, deliberation would continue. Unofficially, we had conceded. The luminous countdown lights extinguished. The chamber exhaled as one organism. No cheers erupted, no declarations of triumph. The atmosphere remained heavy, contemplative. The human ambassador inclined their head, not in victory, but acknowledgement. They had not won through force. They had forced reflection. As delegates began withdrawing from the amphitheater, private communication channels flared with urgent recalibration. Doctrines would need revision. Humanitarian clauses expanded. Intervention parameters clarified. Because the old framework had been exposed, and none of us had defended it convincingly. I remained seated long after the chamber began to empty. For centuries, I had believed our greatest strength was control over conflict, over escalation, over narrative. Yet in a single crisis, a younger species had revealed the fragility beneath that control. They asked a question we could not answer. Why had we tolerated suffering in the name of stability? We had no adequate defense. As the human ambassador exited the chamber alone, no escort, no guard, I felt an unfamiliar sensation. Not resentment, not fear, something closer to respect. Humanity had forced the galaxy to confront its own indifference, and when the moment came to defend that indifference, we chose silence. The vote that never happened would not be recorded as a defeat, but history would remember it as a turning point. Because on that day, the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy hesitated before a simple truth. Compassion had destabilized a war, and none of us were prepared to argue that it should not have. Revolutions are rarely announced. They do not always arrive with fleets or fire. Sometimes they are written into policy revisions. In the cycles following the vote that never happened, the Council did what it has always done when confronted with disruption. We adapted, quietly. The official record framed it as procedural refinement, clarifications to interstellar engagement standards, updates to civilian oversight mandates, expansions of humanitarian exemptions during contained conflicts. But those of us who had stood in the chamber knew the truth. The revisions bore a distinct human imprint. Civilian protection clauses, once vague and easily bypassed, were rewritten with precise thresholds.
If casualty projections exceeded defined parameters, neutral corridors could be established without full council vote. Neutral humanitarian corridors. The phrase itself would have been unthinkable cycles earlier. Now it was doctrine. War oversight committees were granted investigatory authority beyond simple observation. They could issue temporary ceasefire recommendations pending ethical review. Ethical review, a concept once relegated to academic symposiums, now embedded in military calculus. None of these reforms were attributed directly to humanity. Official communiques cited emerging interstellar consensus. But we all understood where the consensus had begun. And what unsettled us most was not the policy shift. It was the behavior of the species that inspired it. Humanity did not request elevated status within the Council. They did not leverage public support to demand additional voting weight. They did not construct a coalition bloc to rival elder powers. They returned to the former war zone. I monitored their fleet movements out of habit. Relief vessels once again filled their departure logs. Reconstruction materials replaced emergency medical cargo. Joint Virillion-Korth infrastructure projects listed human contractors as secondary participants rather than primary directors. They were rebuilding cities they had no claim over, repairing orbital platforms from which they would draw no exclusive profit. I confronted the human ambassador during a recess interval cycles later. "You have gained influence," I observed. "Why not formalize it?" The human regarded me with that same unsettling steadiness. Influence doesn't need formalizing. It needs maintaining. Through policy leverage, I asked. Through trust. The word again. Always that word. Trust. We had spent millennia equating strength with domination. Military superiority ensured compliance. Economic leverage ensured cooperation. Fear ensured order. Humanity had introduced another model: responsibility as strength.
Minor species began citing human protocols when negotiating new defense treaties. Elder powers referenced civilian oversight guidelines during fleet mobilizations, not because they were legally compelled to, but because public expectation had shifted. The narrative of power was evolving. Where once a species proved strength through conquest, now they risked scrutiny if they ignored humanitarian thresholds. And scrutiny in a connected galaxy spreads rapidly. I reviewed internal memos from Virelian strategists acknowledging that future conflicts must account for civilian optics to avoid human-style destabilization. Even the Korth ascendancy, once dismissive of sentiment, integrated humanitarian liaison units into their fleet structure, not out of weakness, out of pragmatism. Humanity had demonstrated that compassion could alter strategic outcomes. To ignore that lesson would be strategically negligent. And yet, for all their influence, humans remained restrained. They did not posture. They did not remind us of the vote. They continued acting as though the galaxy had nearly sanctioned them. That humility disturbed several elder delegates more than open ambition would have. Ambition can be countered. It can be negotiated. It can be threatened. Humility paired with conviction is far more difficult to manage because it cannot be easily manipulated. One Virelian elder confided in a private channel, "They are redefining strength without seeking supremacy." There was unease in that admission. If strength was no longer synonymous with domination, then many of our historical triumphs would require re-examination. Entire doctrines built on deterrence would appear archaic. Humanity did not dismantle our old order through rebellion. They exposed its fragility by offering an alternative, a system where influence was earned through visible responsibility, where smaller civilizations aligned not out of fear, but out of belief that their survival mattered. That belief is powerful. It motivates cooperation beyond contractual obligation. It inspires defense without coercion. It transforms alliances into communities.
I stood once more in the council chamber cycles later, observing a debate over a minor border dispute in a distant sector. When casualty projections rose above acceptable thresholds, a delegate invoked the newly codified humanitarian corridor provision. There was no laughter, no dismissal. The motion passed unanimously. I felt the weight of that moment, a procedural adjustment perhaps, but also a philosophical shift. The galaxy had not transformed overnight. Wars would still occur, conflicts would still simmer, political maneuvering would persist. But a new variable now existed within our calculus: responsibility. And that variable bore a human signature. As I watched delegates reference doctrines inspired by a species once labeled naive, I understood something unsettling. We had believed humanity fragile because of their biology: soft tissue, limited natural weapons, no exoskeletons. We had misjudged where their resilience lay. It was not in armor, it was in conviction. They had endured a death world by refusing to surrender to inevitability. Now they were reshaping a galaxy by refusing to surrender to indifference. Power without ambition, influence without coercion, strength defined not by what one could destroy, but by what one chose to protect. And in redefining strength that way, humanity had revealed an uncomfortable truth. Our old order had survived for millennia not because it was flawless, but because no one had challenged its moral foundation. Until now. History often searches for spectacle, for the explosion that shattered an empire, for the armada that darkened a star, for the speech that ignited rebellion. But when scholars now analyze the moment the balance of our galaxy shifted, they return not to a battle, but to a silence. Cycles have passed since that day in the council chamber. Trade routes have stabilized under revised doctrine. Humanitarian corridors have become standard clauses in conflict arbitration. Minor systems speak with greater confidence. Elder powers measure optics alongside firepower. And yet, when I close my ocular membranes during rest cycles, I see only one image: a single human standing beneath the luminous dome, unarmored, unafraid, surrounded by species whose civilizations predate their written history by millennia. We could have crushed them, politically isolated their systems, restricted their trade, relegated them to peripheral status for generations. The machinery of enforcement was ready, the votes nearly aligned. Instead, we hesitated. That hesitation was the fracture line. At the time, we told ourselves it was strategic recalibration, economic prudence, ethical ambiguity. But memory has a way of stripping excuses from truth. We hesitated because in that silence, we recognized something we could not counter. Humanity's power was not derived from fleets. Their armadas, though capable, did not rival ours. It was not technological supremacy. Several elder species still surpassed them in energy manipulation and quantum engineering. It was not economic leverage. Their markets were influential, but not dominant. It was conviction, the certainty that they would act even alone if action meant protecting life. That certainty made them unpredictable, and unpredictability, when anchored in moral consistency, becomes unstoppable. I remember scanning the chamber that day. Virelian luminescence dimmed in contemplation, Korth armor stilled in calculation. Minor delegates watching not with fear, but with something closer to hope. Hope is dangerous. It cannot be coerced. It cannot be bombarded into submission. It spreads quietly, like light bending around obstacles. When the vote dissolved and the chamber exhaled, no one declared humanity victorious. But something fundamental had shifted: the narrative of strength. Before that day, strength meant deterrence, the capacity to end conflict through overwhelming force, the ability to dictate terms without opposition. After that day, strength began to include responsibility, the willingness to intervene not for conquest, but for protection. Humanity did not announce this redefinition.
They embodied it, and embodiment is more persuasive than proclamation. In subsequent cycles, I observed young delegates from peripheral systems cite humanity during policy debates. If they can risk themselves for civilians, why can we not risk procedural inconvenience? Such questions would have once been dismissed as sentimental. Now they carried weight, because we had seen the results. The Virelian Korth border once glowed with weapons fire. Now it glows with joint orbital platforms and shared infrastructure, not because humanity conquered it, because they refused to abandon it. That refusal echoes still. There is a particular moment I revisit often, just before the vote dissolved. The chamber lights dimmed, the countdown paused, and the human ambassador stood motionless at the center. No plea for mercy, no attempt to rally support, no visible fear. Only quiet certainty. They had already accepted whatever consequence followed their actions, because the action itself had been the point. That realization unsettled us. A species willing to endure punishment rather than abandon its principles cannot be easily controlled. Threats lose potency, isolation loses leverage. If they would act even alone, then no coalition could fully contain them. That is when I understood. Humanity was never dangerous because of what they could destroy. They were dangerous because of what they refused to abandon. Compassion, responsibility, the belief that lives on distant worlds held equal value to their own. Those beliefs, when held lightly, are fragile. When held with conviction, they are tectonic. Our galaxy did not change in a blaze of war. No capital world burned, no armada shattered in glorious combat. It changed in a chamber filled with silence, a silence heavy enough to bend doctrine, heavy enough to force ancient civilizations to confront their own indifference. And in that silence, we saw the future. Not a future dominated by humanity through conquest, but a future influenced by them through example. We could have crushed them that day. Instead, we listened, and by listening, we allowed a new doctrine to root. I remain a servant of the Council. I still believe in order, in balance, in the necessity of difficult decisions. But I no longer equate stability with indifference, because I witnessed what happened when a single species chose to act rather than wait. They did not roar, they did not threaten, they stood, and the galaxy shifted around them. When historians speak of turning points, they often search for spectacle. Let them look instead to that silence, to the moment when the most powerful civilizations in existence hesitated before a simple truth, and to the species that proved power is not measured by the worlds you can destroy, but by the lives you refuse to abandon.